Governor Tim Walz is saying that you and others that are out there trying to expose this, you're doing it because you're white supremacists. What is your response to him?
Yeah, Tim wants votes. There are entire apartment complexes where white people have been pushed out of these apartment complexes because Somalians have taken over and they're inside of these towns like Minneapolis where they can go get votes from these people. And if you have 100,000 people that will vote for you because you're going to enable and let this stuff happen and because you're going to call a white person racist for calling out facts, this is what's going to happen to a state like Minnesota. Minnesotans, they say Minnesota nice, but they are very upset. And I totally understand why they're upset because they don't have a governor who's actually working for them. He's actually working against them.
Tonight, the power script flipped. Trump drops nightmare court-martial news, and suddenly Tim Walz is facing the kind of collapse they swore would never happen. The smiles are gone, the room is chaos, and the cover-ups are exposed. People are furious at being labeled for speaking the truth, and the backlash is real. The base is boiling, staff talk walkout, and the narrative is in total meltdown. Allegations, votes, backroom deals, all of it crashing at once. This is about democracy, betrayal, and who the government really works for. Walz's fall may have just begun, and what happens next will shock you. All right.
It's done.
A packed room at the St. Paul Armory erupted after the governor's signature made driver's license for all the law of the land.
So we give driver's licenses to anyone here. You don't have to be a citizen. You don't have to, which is a photo ID. So if someone comes in, they register, they have the driver's license, but they have an incorrect social or no social or whatever. So then they become incomplete. But if they walk in to vote with their driver's license,
shock you. All right, let's just say it. If any Republican governor presided over a system where non-citizens could slip into the voter rolls, where a massive welfare fraud ring robbed taxpayers blind, and then turned around and blamed white men when the scandal finally hit the headlines, the media would be calling for handcuffs by sunrise. But this is Tim Walz, so instead of a perp walk, he gets protection. Instead of a real court-martial, he gets MSNBC. Tonight, we're going to hold the trial that the corporate press refuses to touch. Here's the heart of it. In 2023, Walz signs a law that lets people who are in this country illegally get Minnesota driver's licenses. That alone is controversial enough. But then you listen to Minnesota officials at the Capitol explain how that same ID, a government-issued photo ID, can end up being used at the polls, and suddenly Elon Musk's tweet starts to make sense. Walz actively scamming elections, he posts, reacting to what Minnesotans themselves are saying. Now the defenders say, relax, they still have to check a box and attest they're citizens. On paper, that sounds nice. In the real world, you've just given non-citizens a state-approved ID, plugged it into a system that's already full of holes, and then you're shocked when people warn this could be abused. And when lawmakers actually press the officials on it, you hear exactly where the loophole lives. If you show up with that driver's license, even if your registration was flagged as incomplete, that challenge disappears and you're allowed to cast a ballot. That's not conspiracy talk. That's what the officials themselves are calmly describing in a hearing.
Does that make them all of a sudden now okay?
Mr. Linnell.
Madam Chair, so the designation on the roster for someone whose registration had been incomplete, if they present the election judge with that acceptable identification document, that would clear the challenge from the roster and they would be permitted to cast a ballot.
Mr. Anderson.
Well, okay, there's your problem, potentially. So, thank you.
So just to clarify, someone who is not a citizen but presents a driver's license at that point in the process could be permitted to vote?
Madam Chair, at the time of registration, as well as at the time of submitting a ballot, every voter is signing the attestation affirming their eligibility to vote, including that they meet all eligibility requirements, that they are a U.S. citizen.
Think about what that means. We spend years fighting over voter ID, over election integrity, over whether our system is secure. We're told over and over again, there's no way non-citizens could vote. Stop the misinformation. Then along comes Minnesota, under Tim Walz, proudly handing out licenses to people who are not citizens and building a process where the only thing between that ID and the ballot box is a checked box on a form and a promise that nobody would ever lie. That's not a safeguard. That's a dare. And it doesn't stop with elections. While all this is happening, Minnesota gets rocked by one of the biggest welfare fraud cases in American history, the Feeding Our Future scandal. Hundreds of millions, approaching billions in alleged fraud and related programs according to public reporting. Around 100 people charged, scores already convicted. A huge chunk tied to a small network that supposedly was feeding kids and instead lined their own pockets. Now let me be very clear here, because the media will twist this. Tim Walz, 𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐜𝐿, they have not been charged in this fraud ring. No one is saying they personally stole the money, but the web of connections around them is ugly. Campaign events at the same restaurant linked to the players, donors and meetings involving the Attorney General's office, whistleblowers and oversight officials warning for years that something was wrong, and a governor whose agencies kept signing the checks. If this were a Republican network in Texas or Florida, it would be the scandal of the decade. Instead, because it's Minnesota and it touches favored identity groups, the political class wants it quiet. Critics online look at that web and say, hold on, this is at least political accountability territory. And they're right to ask, so how does Governor Walz respond when he's finally pressed on this disaster? Does he apologize to taxpayers, promise a full, aggressive cleanup of his own agencies, thank the whistleblowers who stuck their necks out? No, he pivots to race.
Ilhan Omar, Tim Walz, Attorney General 𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐬𝐿. We see a web of connections between them and those directly involved in the fraud. For example, Ilhan Omar alleged enabling introducing the 2020 Meals Act, which was ultimately subject to fraud. Held a campaign victory party at the Safari restaurant. That's where one of the men who run that restaurant has associations to the convicted individuals.
Instead of focusing on the actual fraud, he starts talking about a majority of crime is white men, and how white men should be holding other white men accountable, as if this entire welfare theft ring is really just an excuse to deliver a lecture about demographics. You hear that, and you realize two things at once. First, he's trying to make this about anything except the specific failure in front of him. Second, identity politics has become a shield for people in power. If the numbers and the facts point in a direction they don't like, they just zoom out and say, well, actually, let's talk about white men. That doesn't fix one stolen dollar. It doesn't fix one broken system. It just tells regular Minnesotans that if they ask too many questions, they'll be accused of bigotry. And that's the pattern. When critics point out that giving non-citizens driver's licenses makes it easier to blur the line between citizens and non-citizens at the polls, they're smeared as racist or anti-immigrant. When taxpayers ask why billions were flowing out the door to fake meal sites, they're told to be quiet and not attack communities. When whistleblowers sound the alarm, they're ignored until the FBI shows up years later and the damage is already done. This is how you end up with a two-tier system of justice and a two-tier system of accountability. One standard if you're a conservative, a Trump supporter, a small business owner who made a mistake on paperwork. Another standard if you're plugged into the right circles, the right nonprofits, the right identity groups, and the right political machine. And there's Elon Musk from the outside, looking at Minnesota's new driver's license law, looking at the way officials describe the process, and he just says the quiet part out loud. This looks like a way to game the system. Walz actively scamming elections. That's his opinion, but millions of Americans hear it and say, yeah, that's exactly how it feels. Again, the point isn't that every person with one of these licenses is voting illegally. The point is that our leaders are deliberately blurring the guardrails that protect citizenship, voting, and public money. They create systems that are almost designed to be abused. And when you notice, they call you names instead of fixing the problem. Think about what your life looks like compared to that. If you mess up your taxes by a couple $1,000s, the IRS comes knocking. If you accidentally break a rule in your small business, regulators don't pat you on the back and say, well, you checked a box. But when a politically connected fraud ring siphons off mountains of cash that was supposed to feed kids, it takes years for anyone in power to act. And the top people whose agencies failed just move on to the next talking point.
And then there's Tim Walz, House Oversight Investigation role in his role as governor, or 𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐬𝐿, the Attorney General. His job is to enforce the law in Minnesota, but instead he's getting donations after meeting with the Feeding Our Future representatives. The Feeding Our Future, the biggest known yet part of this entire theft ring.
That's why this feels like a court-martial moment for Tim Walz in the eyes of regular voters. Nobody is saying he's walking into an actual military tribunal. What we're saying is that in a healthy republic, a governor who presides over this mix of election vulnerability and welfare chaos would be facing real political consequences, not softball questions and race-baiting deflections. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a Minnesota story. It's a national pattern. Blue state governors and big city mayors keep pushing policies that weaken borders, blur citizenship, and feed a growing, unaccountable, nonprofit industrial complex that lives off your tax dollars. Then they act offended when anyone suggests that this machine might also be a machine for power and for abuse. You and I know better. We've watched the same people who scream about democracy quietly build systems that make it harder to tell who's actually voting. We've watched them chant about equity while letting politically favored fraudsters raid programs meant for the poor. We've watched them talk about accountability while shaming anyone who asks where the money went. And notice who they always blame when things go wrong. Not the agencies that failed, not the political donors who got rich, not the insiders who looked the other way. No, they blame some vague, faceless mass called white men, or right-wing media, or misinformation. Anybody but the people who signed the contracts and looked at the checks. That's not leadership, that's hiding. So where does this leave Minnesotans tonight? They're stuck with a governor whose policies opened doors that never should have been opened, whose agencies missed one of the largest frauds in state history, and whose instinct, when pressed, is to pivot to race instead of responsibility. They're also stuck with a media class more interested in policing the tone of his critics than in digging into the documents.
Do you want to hear more from members and leaders from the Somali community to say, we need to look at ourselves, we need to hold our own neighbors accountable, because look at the damage that this has done to our community. What do you want to hear more from, instead of just saying, don't blame us? Do you want to see more ownership and oversight from within this?
Look, it's not law-abiding citizens. If that were the case, there's a lot of white men should be holding a lot of white men accountable for the crimes that they have committed. I think for the community to maybe educate their population, because I think what you're seeing here is there are secondary victims in this, that there's providers inside the community that are then victimizing the community themselves by signing them up, because when we're going to some of these people, they're like, I had no idea I was in this program. So I think it's asking us then, for every crime, which of course the majority being committed by white men, asking us to do more about that. I think it's crime in general. And I think the biggest thing on this is just making sure that we're educating the population. And again, this is 80 people or so that have been convicted in this, maybe some more in that.
But here's the good news. The truth has a way of getting out anyway. Court documents get unsealed. Trials happen. Testimony is recorded. Clips circulate. People start to connect the dots. And suddenly the story that was supposed to stay local or buried becomes a case study in how not to run a state. And once you see it in Minnesota, you start looking for it everywhere else. Where else are non-citizen IDs quietly being woven into the voter system? Where